GWP News Weekly. I'm your host, Isaac Hedges, and our top stories tonight we'll be looking at an extra dog sled, adios chavismo, and a tax toss-up. All that and much, much more coming your way here on GWP News Weekly. Well, folks, as you might have noticed, we are trying something a little bit different this week. Again, you might have noticed that I'm not joined here in the studio, as I usually am, co-host Jacob Fulmer, but not to worry, you won't be stuck with yours truly for much longer, as we will be seeing him a bit later for our weather and sports segments right here, this very episode of GWP News, so it shouldn't be too long. Hopefully, all will be able to survive that. Now, again, in the meantime, recent events we've seen certainly on a national level and with international implications. Certainly, of course, President Trump recently made the remark in reference to Greenland that they recently added a dog sled. Now, one just upon hearing this casually wouldn't be blamed for assuming that he was merely joking, but at second glance, sort of looking into it a bit more, one will find that Greenland's national defense actually does involve fairly majorly dog sleds. Again, it's a big part of their national defense, somewhat surprisingly, certainly to our domestic audience here. This isn't something that we see all the time. Now, again, this is a big part of it. They call in Greenland their Sirius Patrol, their Sirius Dog Sled Patrol. That's SIRIUS, Sirius Dog Sled Patrol. And, well, it would appear that, though it may have sounded like a joke, well, President Trump was being serious about that. And this is especially interesting in light of recent developments. Of course, anyone who has been following this will likely be aware that the United States recently has expressed a great deal of interest in acquiring Greenland. And certainly this isn't anything new. This is something President Trump mentioned fairly early on in his presidency, something I believed, as many others do, that this is in the interest of our national security. Now, in terms of the interest of the other parties, we've already seen a great deal of objection from Greenland themselves, from Denmark, which now owns Greenland, which certainly is worth noting in terms of different nations, in terms of different countries. Well, Greenland has about the shortest independent history of any nation of all. Now, they've changed hands a fair bit throughout history, but for a vast majority of history, they've been owned by another country. Of course, currently, as we mentioned, Greenland is owned by Denmark, European country. Again, both of them have expressed considerable objection to the U.S.'s interest in acquiring Greenland, as it were, and for that matter, all across Europe, all across the European Union. Interestingly, we've even heard from France recently objecting to that. Of course, the French president there, Emmanuel Macron, recently made a comment in reference to this whole conflict that, again, in the event that the United States were really to pursue military action and actually conquering, actually taking over and acquiring Greenland, that France would come to their defense. And interestingly, of course, we haven't exactly known France in recent times for some time, perhaps since the time of Hamlet's death. Well, France hasn't exactly been known for their military might in some time. So, of course, leading up to this remark by the French president, Emmanuel Macron, we already saw considerable objection from the folks in Greenland themselves, certainly folks in Denmark, which owns Greenland. And they were somewhat, at that point, still somewhat firm in holding on to Greenland and not letting the United States take over. But again, ever since the French military, again, supposedly being offered up at their aid. Well, now they seem somewhat more open to working with the United States, as it were. Now, that said, they still object to a considerable degree to it, just seem to be being a bit more diplomatic than before, as it would seem. And something worth noting, certainly in the event that it would ever come to this. Now, again, it's been debated a great deal as to how serious our president is about wanting to take over Greenland. Again, what role exactly that would play in our national security. But if nothing else, there has been talk of it. Now, from a practical standpoint, were this to actually happen, one might ask, were the United States actually to take military and intervene in Greenland? Well, how exactly would that shake out? And as one might expect, things would likely be in our favor. Of course, naturally, having the military might, being a major world power, as many would say, the global hegemon that the United States is. Of course, Greenland, many may not know a great deal about Greenland's military, about what exactly they've got to work with in terms of national defense. But again, as far as what we know on that front, a big part of it relies, largely due to their weather, certainly a lot of snow in that area, on dog sleds, as it has for a vast majority of their history. Now, these dog sleds, of course, certainly a dog sled, naturally a person on that sled, so it's a two-man team ordinarily, with 11 to 15 sled dogs on a given sled. Now, in terms of the numbers, how exactly things line up in comparison with the United States, well, to recent count, again, there has been talk recently, of course, recent remarks say perhaps they added an actual dog sled. Now, how much difference will that make? Certainly is up for debate, but in terms of recent estimates of Greenland's national defense, namely the serious dog sled troops, again, that's Sirius, Sirius, they have 14 to 16 soldiers deployed at any given time in terms of how many they've got available. And again, that is for the entirety of Greenland. Of course, as we know, a fairly small country. That's sort of to be expected with many of these little countries like Greenland. Certainly in the case of Greenland being owned for a vast majority of its history by another larger country. And of course, taking that in comparison with the U.S. military, as many might have guessed, in the U.S. military, we have more than 14 to 16 people. Again, according to recent estimates, the U.S. military includes over 1.3 million active duty personnel. So certainly it would seem it goes without saying that were it to actually come to military conflict, as some suggest it would, there wouldn't be a great deal of question as to who would have the advantage in that conflict, but it is due to that precisely that perhaps it is somewhat less likely, somewhat unlikely, certainly in Greenland with their own military, as it were, that things actually would come to this. And we've even seen in recent times, they seem to have softened considerably. Now, again, unclear from the United States if we're actually going to pursue with this. Again, historically, we've been on good terms with Greenland, and again, have certainly done work there, and I already have some degree of freedom to work there, but now in terms of actually owning Greenland, and some may think, oh, this sort of conquest, this sort of expansion, oh, it's unprecedented. Well, this is a bit crazy. Why exactly would we do this? Well, it's not entirely unprecedented. Certainly, as we previously mentioned, just in the case of Greenland, they've changed hands many times throughout their history, and for a majority of their history, they have been owned by another larger country. So for a long time now, that's been Denmark, and so perhaps too, it could just as easily be the United States if things came to that, which of course they did. Again, it's not looking abundantly likely that things would actually lead to that. That is a major issue in the United States. Certainly, there are a number of other issues going on already that are worth our attention, if not of more concern than this. And certainly, one of those being, of course, in recent times and in other international affairs. Many of those out there will know, certainly those who follow us here on GWP News very closely will be aware, of course, that the United States recently took the Venezuelan dictator, so-called President Nicolas Maduro, into custody. Now, again, this was followed by a great deal of issue, largely with, again, drugs coming into the United States, many of which being deadly, and that went on for some time. Now, in terms of claims, Maduro's claims as to what he's actually doing there, well, something important that we noted and something quite interesting, of course, the claim is that he was democratically elected, and to the best of our knowledge, he was at some point. It's just that a fair bit of time has passed, and again, to our recent count, you'll have to double check in our last edition of GWP News Weekly, but I believe it's been about 7 years since Maduro has termed out, and again, he's refused to leave office and has sort of stayed there. Again, those are sort of the qualities and the things going on there. Considerable degree of chaos, certainly leading up to this, which again are the common reasons that are attributed to here whenever we refer to him, or whenever people, certainly we're not the only ones, there are many others that regard Maduro as a dictator, and well, if there was any question of that, that should help to explain a little bit of that. Now, in terms of what's going on in Venezuela now, how exactly are things going to work now that Maduro, their so-called president, isn't there anymore? Well, what's going to happen in the regime that they've been under for some time in Venezuela, known as Chavismo, again, namesake being Hugo Chavez, again, famous for in that area, sort of that particular flavor of National Socialism in that area, again, usually governed or led, certainly in this case, by a dictator of some sort, generally speaking. And again, there's been some recent question, even at the time that this happened, as to will it actually help that much? Will there be much of a regime change after the United States takes out Maduro, as it will? Will they have someone better come along to replace him? Someone that, again, that leads, that governs in a way that's more in line with the interest of the United States, at the very least, that'll help to stop this drug trafficking problem with these things coming in to the United States? Or will the person that follows him be just as bad? And again, we have yet to see at this point. There appears to be, again, after he's been taken into custody, there appears to not have been a clear answer. Again, a decent amount of chaos still in that area, but there appears to be what we call an internal split there between the pragmatists, which are led by Delcy Rodriguez there in Venezuela, again, who is actually attempting and working here, open dialogue with the United States, probably seen recently, again, visited the United States here, spoke with our president, actually attempting to collaborate with the United States here. Now, on the other end of that, you've got the hardliners, who are led by Diosdado Cabello, again, who controls militias and resists concessions there. Again, concessions there, as they call them in the case to the other party, in this, the pragmatists. But again, not abundantly clear who will reign victorious in the whole thing, whether it ultimately will end up in the best interest of the United States or not. Certainly, we can only hope. There's certainly efforts to patch things up on behalf before, as we mentioned, of the pragmatist end of things in Venezuela, with Delcy Rodriguez attempting to work things out with President Trump. But again, that is a developing story, very recent things on that, which we will continue to follow. And I believe that, again, is the extent of available information on that at this point. So moving on to other recent events in terms of that, well, moving on to a local or more regional level here in the state of Missouri, well, there's been a recent proposal by our governor, Mike Kehoe, to do away with our state income tax, or it's certainly been proposed by different legislators across the state of Missouri. But again, we may be headed toward one of the biggest tax shifts in our state's history. Now, our governor, Mike Kehoe, again, wants voters to decide whether to eliminate the state income tax entirely. So that's been in talks for some time, certainly in Missouri. Of course, recently there are a number of states who have already done this, so this wouldn't be entirely unprecedented. We would be following suit with states like Tennessee and Texas that have already done away with their income tax. And again, generally what happens there, whenever they remove income tax, it's sort of replaced by a little bit of an increase in some different areas. We just adjust, again, some different departments on the sales tax to make up for that sales revenue, not the sales revenue, that tax revenue that we lost after discontinuing the income tax. Now, again, supporters' argument here for doing away with the income tax here in the state of Missouri that it would make Missouri more competitive than states like Tennessee and Texas, again, in terms of competition, in terms of bringing in things that attract to get more state revenue. Naturally, when different businesses are looking at setting up in different areas and in different states, naturally they prefer to be somewhere most likely that doesn't have just an exorbitantly, ridiculously high income tax rate. And that's exactly what we've seen in recent times. Certain businesses, certainly moving to Texas, things really seem to be booming there. Certainly Austin, Dallas, just a couple of the major cities in Texas. Again, a lot of development in recent times. We're seeing a similar thing in Tennessee, which has also done away with the income tax. Now, again, as we mentioned, in terms of correcting for that, what exactly would be happening there? Well, in place of income tax, what we would be doing is just bringing our sales tax up a little bit. And again, that would be in areas, sort of new areas, different things like subscriptions, again, digital services, online advertising, different new things like that. And again, we've seen this in recent times. Naturally, when new products are introduced to markets, we don't have a great feel for exactly how that's going to shake out. And in turn, initially, we don't have a great idea how those things ought to be taxed in terms of sales tax. But certainly, as these things have been in the market longer, we see those rates begin to change. Naturally, those sales tax rates are different for different sorts of items. We've already seen this in recent times. Certainly, as some of the health effects have become more widely known about smoking, certainly in that case, we've seen a higher sales tax on tobacco products. So different things like that. Again, this certainly is not unprecedented on that front. Now, again, what do the critics say? What do the people on the other side of this? Well, they say that this could shift the tax burden toward working families and raise sales taxes on everyday purchases, which is somewhat counterintuitive if we really put this into perspective, because Again, theoretically, in principle, sort of the way this is supposed to work. Certainly, income tax in relation to sales tax, they are supposed to be somewhat proportionate naturally. Naturally, the amount that you're taxed on, of course, that's directly correlated with the amount of taxable income that you have, or at least amount of taxable income which you report, which again you are legally required to do. But that said, naturally there is some degree, perhaps a great degree, of fraud in terms of income tax. Again, a number of different unconventional businesses, as one that might call them, different under the table dealings. People don't necessarily report to the state and so aren't necessarily taxed on in the same way. Different gigs like selling firewood, again, doing little concerts, different things like that in terms of gigs. And we've seen in recent times actually considerable growth in that. Any articles that you've seen referring to a gig economy. Again, this is sort of the idea there of what's going on. So again, this disparity that we might see that might occur again between the tax burden here, as the critics mention here, on working families and sales tax and how that might make it difficult. Well, it's not that that's just naturally difficult, that disparity is naturally there. Well, perhaps that can more aptly be explained by degrees of income tax fraud. And again, many of the things we're purchasing in stores, groceries, different things like that, they're things that most everyone purchases at some point. Everyone that makes a purchase anywhere is paying the sales tax. And so, again, proponents of this change suggest that, again, this would keep the taxpayers a bit more honest in terms of, oh, perhaps they are doing these different gigs where they're earning this income that they're not necessarily reporting to the state, not necessarily paying all the taxes on that they're supposed to be. Well, they're still going to need to go to the store and buy some groceries, some different things to eat, and maybe even a bit more. And so they don't have to pay the taxes, but they aren't paying their income taxes in the way that they're supposed to, just aren't reporting that income. Well, that'll come back on sales tax again, sort of keeping the taxpayer honest. So, a couple different important points to note there. Again, certainly, if it's any indication, as we mentioned previously, recent states that have done this, certainly like Texas, Tennessee, have already done away with their state individual income tax, which is what Missouri is now looking at doing. And again, if that's any indication of what would happen were we to implement such a policy in Missouri, well, that might just benefit business in our state, which again, more of these businesses coming into our state ultimately means more tax revenue for the state. Naturally, there are more people coming into the state, spending their dollars there, and that sales tax is still going to the state. So, again, that's huge. And naturally, the state of Missouri, of course, we have a number of different things, a number of different draws on our state. Of course, a big thing, Jake and I talked about previously here on GWP News, certainly, I believe, even on the Great World podcast in recent episodes, but historically, major draw on our site has been a lot of our major league sporting events. Of course, we have our teams here. We have the Kansas City Chiefs, though not for long. Again, we've got the Kansas City Royals, just to name a couple here in our state. And naturally, of course, as we mentioned previously, the Kansas City Chiefs, unfortunately, we're losing them. They appear to be going over to the dark side, over to Kansas. So, again, a great loss for the state of Missouri. And naturally, with not as many people coming here to Old Arrowhead for those games, again, buying those expensive tickets and again, perhaps going to stores while they're here, different things when they're going to these games. Naturally, that is going to hurt our state. So perhaps in light of recent events, certainly if there's any chance that this may benefit our state tax revenue in terms of that, perhaps this would be beneficial. But again, this is recent, and whether this will take effect or not, again, appears fairly likely, but not a whole lot of additional information on that at this point, which we will continue to cover. Naturally, of course, we've covered previous election cycles, certainly as we did in 2024, right here on GWP. Again, we will continue to do that in the future. You can find all of that right here, again, from GWP, our Great World Productions, as we've been known, again, since the start of the year here in 2026. But again, we will continue to follow that, certainly in case that it becomes a ballot measure, see how things shake out there, which is looking fairly likely at this point. But again, I do believe that is the extent of the information we have on that. Any other information that you would like to contribute, as we've mentioned previously, you can always do that in the comments down below this video. If you'd like to give us a call at our brand new phone number, you can do that as well, 417-448-0819. Just let us know if there's anything you'd like to have us cover. If you'd like to come on our newscasts, come on the podcast, or anything of the sort, just let us know. We'd love to hear from you. Again, that number is 417-448-0819. And that concludes our news segment. Up next is Weather with Jacob Fulmer.
Thank you, Isaac, for the update. I will go ahead and take things over from here on our weather report for this edition here of the weekly news. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to start off by looking at the national forecast chart that is courtesy of NOAA/National Weather Service Weather Prediction Center. So you can always find this online, of course. But as you'll notice, we had a cold front that moved through here last night. That is what dropped our temperatures back into the teens. One of the reasons why here across the state of Missouri, a lot of high temperatures were in the upper teens and low to mid 20s today. We even had a few snow showers across some of the areas here, especially to the south here. But you'll notice that that cold front certainly brought in much colder times here, and then we're also dealing with some lake effect snow across the Great Lakes. So those are the main weather features that we're dealing with for today. As far as our current weather alerts that we currently have, so this is looking at all of the weather alerts across the country here. You'll notice that we have what is called a cold weather advisory, and so that's only issued when wind chills get to a dangerous level. Frostbite across these areas could settle in as little as 30 minutes tonight. That includes North Dakota, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, even into northern Michigan. And then we also have those winter storm warnings across the Great Lakes in New York and into Michigan, where we're dealing with that lake effect snow. Also, we have cold weather advisories across Indiana, as well as Ohio, Kentucky, into West Virginia, and into Pennsylvania. We even have what is called an extreme cold warning, which is a level above that cold weather advisory as far as the danger goes. And so a lot of colder air has settled in, and again, that lake effect snow with that colder air across the Great Lakes here. No weather alerts currently across the state of Missouri, but that could certainly change as we're going to be dealing with a bigger storm system as we go into the later part of this week that's going to affect us here in Missouri as well as points further to the south. Now, because we are still about 3 to 5 days out from this storm system, there is still a lot of uncertainty. We're going to continue to keep you updated here on GWP as far as any updates or any changes to this forecast as we have them here. These model graphics are courtesy of Levi Cowan from tropicaltidbits.com, so you can find that here. We're going to be looking at three different weather models for our forecast going into the later part of this week. So we're going to start off with the GFS model, which is one that we have looked at pretty frequently here on GWP during those weekly news updates. And we'll look at it today here. Of course, snow continuing across the northern part of the U.S., even some rain across Texas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas. And we're going to see a warm up over the next few days, likely dealing with temperatures above freezing for Tuesday, Wednesday, possibly as well as into Thursday. So a warm up is expected ahead of that next storm system. But then a much cooler air mass is going to move in probably by about Thursday into Friday is when we're expecting that. And the timing, the location, and the impacts, and even the precipitation type are still uncertain at this point in time. Lots of disagreements between these different models. Of course, as we said, this is the GFS model. And you'll notice that a lot of the wintry weather with the GFS model is further to the south of Missouri. So not necessarily here across Missouri. In fact, let's go ahead and zoom in here on that south central region of the U.S. here, showing the potential for freezing rain across these purples and pinks, as well as some sleet and a wintry mix. And then that snow, of course, is in the blue here across Arkansas, Mississippi, and Alabama. This would be Friday night at about 6 p.m. This is according to the latest run from the GFS model as of 12 o'clock today. And so you'll notice that snow building in across Oklahoma and Kansas as we go into this would be Saturday afternoon at about lunchtime. And then as we go into Sunday morning, it begins to move further towards the east. And so not a whole lot of accumulations according to the GFS model. The GFS model has been back and forth between low accumulations, high accumulations, as well as location, although the last couple of runs, we've seen a consistent trend of it moving further towards the south. In fact, here's a look at that 6 o'clock run that we had from this morning. So this is this morning's run of the GFS model, showing a little bit higher totals and also a little bit further to the south. So the GFS model has trended a little bit further to the north, but has a little bit of a weaker system moving in. And so that's what we have with that. What about snowfall amounts? Again, as we mentioned, it's very hard to say at this point in time whether we're going to be looking at low amounts or high amounts. According to the GFS model, as of the latest run, most of Missouri would not see any precipitation. Those storm systems that we're going to be dealing with in the early to middle part of this week are expected to stay to the north across the northern plains, Great Lakes, and that lake effect snow. But that southern system that we're expecting Friday into Saturday and Sunday likely staying down further to the south, as we mentioned. Now, this particular accumulation map does show numbers, but these numbers are assuming a 10-to-1 snow to liquid ratio, which might not be as accurate, especially if we have temperatures that are very far below freezing or well above freezing. That can sometimes change that snow to liquid ratio. And so that's part of the reason why these accumulations numbers will be a little bit off. The other thing is that this particular map here by Tropical Tidbits is showing sleet and snowfall totals. So keep that in mind here. So these numbers will be a little bit on the higher side than what it would probably end up being. And you'll notice that the highest amounts, and again, we won't necessarily talk about specific numbers, but higher amounts are across Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi according to this model. So we're talking Dallas down to Waco, most likely into northern Louisiana, central Mississippi, like around Jackson, and maybe as far south as Baton Rouge. We would not be seeing a whole lot along the Gulf Coast, but that colder air mass would make it down to the Gulf Coast, potentially into Florida as well. So that's something that we could be dealing with. So that's the GFS model. We want to look at another model. This is called the CMC model here. So another one of our three main models that we look at here. This again is also by Tropical Tidbits here. And again, dealing with that snow across the north over the next few days with warmer temperatures returning. So we're going to have a bit of a relief from that winter chill that we've had the last few days here. And so You'll notice, according to this model, that we start off with a lot of rain with that first system, but this particular model, the CMC, is showing much higher amounts, or at least a lot more in the way of rain, snow, and ice, as you'll see here across Oklahoma and Arkansas. Of course, when we talk about the ice, that is the most dangerous type of precipitation, but snow can also be a problem as well. And according to this model, maybe even some thunderstorms out of this on the warmer side. If this storm system does end up being as big as this model is showing, that certainly is a possibility here. And so this is from the morning run of this model here, but you can see that we're dealing with some pretty hefty amounts of snow, potentially, at least as of right now, this latest run showing that across all of Missouri. So this would include the middle of Missouri getting some light accumulations, but heavier accumulations as you go further towards the south. But even that potential for ice across Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, Tennessee, even Alabama could get into play with this storm system. And then it begins to move out as we go into Sunday with much colder temperatures settling in this weekend. Most likely going to be looking at the very least, the coldest air that we've seen so far this season. As far as the total snowfall that we are expecting here, according to this model, again, lighter amounts expected across central and northern Missouri with heavier amounts as you go into southern Missouri and points further to the south as of the latest run. So the difference is the CMC shows a little bit more in the way of accumulations and is a little bit further to the north, which is interesting since the GFS model has also been hinting that this storm can move further towards the north. So overall, what you've seen so far out of these first two models is that there's a lot of uncertainty as far as location and as far as amounts and precipitation types. And since we are 3 to 5 days out, that is to be expected. But especially by the time we get into Wednesday and Thursday, that's when we'll have better idea of what to expect here. We're going to look at one more of the main models here, and this is the European model, again, courtesy of Tropical Tidbits. And so you'll notice that we have a little bit of snowfall across the northern plains, Great Lakes again. So that seems to be pretty much locked in. That's the next couple of days. So pretty confident in that part of the forecast. But as far as the forecast here across Missouri and Oklahoma and Arkansas for this late weekend system, that is what there is uncertainty in. And so once again, we'll zoom into that south central region, including us here in Missouri. And again, the European model also indicating lighter amounts across Missouri, but the GFS model didn't show any amounts where the European model does. So that's one of the main differences. And of course, depending on which model is right or closer to right, that would make a difference in whether or not we see any sort of substantial impacts. The European model showing very heavy snowfall potentially as we go into Saturday afternoon across Oklahoma and Arkansas with that icing threat across Texas, northern Louisiana, and northern Mississippi. This will continue into Sunday, and then that will begin to move out as well. So again, 3 different models, 3 different outcomes. The European model leaning a little bit on the heavier side on accumulations. The CMC model is kind of in the middle, and then the GFS model with the lighter accumulations, but it has been kind of going back and forth, particularly with that GFS model. So again, this is a winter storm that could certainly impact us across southwestern Missouri and central Missouri from Joplin to Nevada as well as Columbia. But as far as impacts and timing and amounts and all of that, still yet to be determined, but the possibility is there. So this is the time when you should probably be at least considering, if you have plans this weekend, how you may have to change those in the event that this does play out the way that it looks like it could, according to like the European model. So just something to monitor very closely. And again, over the next few days, we'll get a better understanding of exactly the timing, the amounts, and the location, and of course, those impacts as well. The good news here is if we zoom in specifically on the state of Missouri, is it looks like our temperatures are going to be too cold for us to see any ice. And again, as we mentioned, ice is definitely the worst type of precipitation that we could see. And so that is certainly good news that we're not concerned about the ice threat here across Missouri. It looks like at this point in time, if we were to see precipitation in Missouri, that 95% of it would be snow. And so, of course, snow is still very impactful on the roads, but it's not as impactful as ice, and it doesn't lead to as much damage from like trees and stuff. It doesn't cause as many travel impacts, and it also does not lead to as many power outages. And so that is certainly good news. We've had many ice storms here over the last couple of years. We had one around this time last year in like around January 5th or 6th, somewhere in that range. We had an ice storm last year across southwestern Missouri. And so the good news is that it does not appear at this time that we would be dealing with that threat. And so that is certainly some good news. But that being said, because it is going to be potentially all snow, that means that it's going to be very cold across here in Missouri. If we're dealing with wintry weather further south of here, that must mean that we're going to get very cold here, and that is what is expected here. So now we're going to look at that temperature from average, like that compared to average type thing here. So we've got the colder temperatures, like below average temperatures across the blue and the purple, and then of course the red, that is where we're going to be dealing with above average temperatures. And this is according here to the GFS model as we go forward in time. Again, temperatures returning to near, maybe even slightly above average by the time we get into Wednesday. But it's by the time we get into Thursday and Friday, that is when the much colder temperatures are anticipated to come in here, potentially looking at upwards to 30 degrees below normal, particularly across the northern plains. Now, here in Missouri, potentially reaching to around 10 to 20 degrees below average, and then into the weekend, staying below average. And then by next week, we will finally deal with temperatures returning to normal, if not even just slightly above what we would normally see for this time of year, above average here. Now, as we talk about actual temperatures, this is by Saturday morning, according to the GFS model. We could be looking at temperatures into the single digits. Wind chills will likely be even colder than that. And so that is something that we'll certainly have to continue to watch as well. And then Sunday, you'll notice temperatures for lows are going to be in the teens, if not the upper single digits. Temperatures finally rising to above freezing by the time we get into the early part of next week. So certainly some of the coldest air that we have seen so far this season. And then, of course, a couple more things that we're going to look at here with the Climate Prediction Center's temperature outlooks from January 25th through the 29th, showing likely below average temperatures across the eastern part of the U.S. So, of course, we focused in here on the central U.S. getting below average temperatures, but this will spread into the eastern part of the country as we go into the early part of next week. Now, behind this storm system, we are expecting precipitation below average, and so that shows that things will dry out behind this storm system. We can even show you that 8 to 14 day outlook with things still below average, precipitation also likely staying below average as we go through the end of the month and into the early part of February beyond this weekend storm system. And then as far as that hazardous temperature outlook, a high risk for hazardous temperatures across the Ohio Valley, with here into western Missouri, we're in that slight risk between January 27th and February 2nd. So coldest air of the season expected this weekend into next week. Still a slight risk for dangerous temperatures is going to be anticipated. That is it for weather. Now we will move into sports. Now we move into our sports segment here. Of course, tonight is a very big night in college football, the national championship game that is taking place this evening in Miami. That game began at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time, so it is already underway, if not already finished at this point in time. We've got Miami versus Indiana. Indiana, of course, has had quite the season, being ranked number 1, Miami ranked number 10. Indiana is also undefeated, so certainly would be quite a victory if they were able to win this year. They've been quite on a roll the last couple of years, so we'll have to see what the outcome of that is. Of course, Indiana is certainly probably the most likely to win based on the statistics, if you look at it like that, so the odds and everything. So Indiana most likely to win based on the odds, but Miami certainly the underdog in this matchup, but we'll have to see what kind kind of a fight they put up in tonight's national championship game. Of course, the college football playoffs is something that we have covered extensively here on GWP News in the sports segment. Now, we also had the playoffs for the Pro League. The NFL has seen the divisional round this past weekend. We had four NFL games, which decided the AFC and NFC championship games, which, of course, those are going to be this coming Sunday. And so we had the Bills and the Broncos on Saturday, that game going into overtime. And so if you haven't watched those games and you still want to watch them without knowing the outcome, just understand that we are going to be looking at those scores. So a bit of a spoiler alert for those scores if you haven't seen those here. So we had the Broncos, which was the home team, won in overtime against the Bills, 33-30, of course, with the Broncos being the number one seed. So they will host the AFC Championship game. Of course, their opponent was either going to be the Texans or the Patriots. The Patriots were at home. The last few times that the Texans have played the Patriots, excuse me, in the divisional round, the Patriots have won, and the Texans are 0-6 going into this past weekend, or were 0-6 in the divisional round. They were facing the elements. The Houston Texans were facing the snowy game there in Foxborough, Massachusetts. But New England did pull off the victory 28-16 at home, making the Texans now 0-7 in the divisional round of playoffs in their franchise history. The Houston Texans in their franchise have never made it to a conference championship game or Super Bowl game. And unfortunately for them, that will not happen this year, as well as the Patriots will be traveling to Denver for the AFC Championship game, where once again, as we mentioned, they will face the Broncos, who won in overtime. On the NFC side of things, Saturday night, we had the matchup of the 49ers and the Seahawks. The Seahawks, hosting as the number one seed, looked very dominant as they won 41-6 in that matchup. Of course, that means the Seattle will be hosting that NFC Championship game next Sunday. So who's the opponent going to be? Well, it actually was determined by yet another overtime game. So the first game of the divisional round went into overtime, as well as the last one, the Rams coming away with the win 20-17 in Chicago. So the Bears definitely had the home field advantage. This game we also saw snow in, so both Sunday games were met with snow throughout the game. And then again, as we mentioned, the Rams won 20-17 against the Bears being the home team that week. But because they are the number two seed, they will be traveling to, they will be traveling to Seattle, that is, for the NFC Championship game. Again, both of those games are going to be taking place next Sunday, with the winners of those two matchups going to the Super Bowl. And so basically what we can conclude is that it's either going to be the Broncos Seahawks, the the Broncos and the Rams, or it could also be the Patriots Seahawks or the Patriots Rams. So those are the possible Super Bowl matchups that we could have. Again, the Super Bowl is going to be coming up on February 8th at 5:30 p.m. Central Time, and that's going to be hosted in California. So we'll find out next Sunday who is going to win that. As far as where you can watch these games, the Patriots Broncos game, which again is that AFC Championship game, that's going to be at 3 o'clock Eastern on CBS, as well as Paramount Plus. And then you can also find the Rams and Seahawks game, which is the NFC Championship game. That's going to be at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time this coming Sunday, and that can be found on Fox and Fox One, are the main channel and streaming services that you can find those matchups at. And so again, it'll be quite interesting to see where we go from here. Both number one and number two seeds in each division are still in it. And so that is certainly going to make things quite interesting as we go. The Rams were not they were not the number two seed. That was the Bears. I was thinking when the Bears, they tied it up in overtime. It was quite exciting if you didn't watch that game. The Bears, they were down by 7 points. It was 17-10, and then they scored a 40-yard touchdown, or nearly a 40-yard touchdown, with about 15 seconds left on a fourth down. And so it was quite the move that they made. But again, as we said, the LA Rams did come up with that overtime win with the field goal. And so the Rams are the number 5 5 seed. So it's the 5 seed and the 1 seed in the NFC, and then the 1 and the 2 seed for the AFC, as we mentioned that. So again, we've got college football championship tonight, and then we'll find out who's in the NFL championship game, otherwise known as the Super Bowl. We'll find out based on the results of this coming Sunday's conference championship matchups. So that's what we're dealing with when it comes to football. We're also going to be looking at those college basketball rankings for both men and women's. We'll go ahead and we'll start off with the women's rankings here. UConn is still undefeated at 19-0. They've won 9 games at home and 6 away games as well, and a 19-game winning streak here. UConn is still at the top with the number 1 spot at this point in time, according to the Associated Press's top 25 rankings. We also have the number 2 team is South Carolina with a 12-game win streak. All of those wins have been, or at least every game at home has been a win. UCLA has also won every game at home and is 17-1. They're on an 11-game win streak. Texas lost a couple of games ago, but they're still number 4 at 19-2, with them winning the most recent game. Both losses were on the road. Vanderbilt is still 19-0. We mentioned the fact that both the men's and women's basketball team for Vanderbilt has been very successful, and so the women's team at number 5 right now. LSU has lost a game at home. They're now 17-2, number 6. Michigan coming in, and Louisville at 7 and 8 respectively, with both having 3 losses. TCU at number 9 and Iowa at number 10, with both of them having 10 losses as well. TCU with their most recent loss, Iowa on a 6-game win streak. Kentucky, Ohio State, Michigan State, Baylor, and Maryland round out the number 11 through 15 spots on that list. And now we'll look at the top 15 across the men's basketball. Again, the regular season goes all the way through the end of February, even into the first couple of days into March. So still a lot of time for these rankings to change here. Arizona at the number 1 seed with an 18-0 start to the season. So pretty impressive there for Arizona at the top. UConn, of course, as we mentioned, is the number 1 in women's basketball. Well, UConn is actually number 2 in the men's basketball. So UConn staying at the top of the list for both men's and women's there. 18-1. UConn is on a 14-game win streak. Michigan, Purdue, and Duke and Houston all at 2 through 6. They've each had only 1 loss. Houston on an 11-game win streak as well. We know that they've made it quite far in the March Madness playoffs for the last several years, currently sitting at the number 6 spot. Nebraska is another undefeated team at number 7 on the rankings. Gonzaga, number 8, 19-1, 12-game win streaks. That's pretty impressive. All road wins and all home games have been wins there. And then we've had Iowa State and Michigan State at number 9 and number 10, 16-2 for both of their records. Illinois is 15-3 on a 7-game win streak. Texas Tech 14-4, but winning every game at home. Number 12 for Texas Tech. BYU, Virginia, and Vanderbilt round out number 13, number 14, and number 15. Vanderbilt losing their last 2 games, which is why they have dropped to number 15, which of course is quite different from the women's team, who's still undefeated at the number 5 spot. Well, that's it for college basketball, and that will round things out for this week's GWP News Weekly Update. Of course, we had Isaac Hedges, who did the current news stories earlier in this newscast, and then I rounded things out here, Jacob Fulmer, signing off here with weather and sports. And oh, and one last thing is I forgot to mention, of course, we also have the GWP Weekly Surprise. So the weekly surprise. And so the weekly surprise this week, in my opinion, would definitely have to be that touchdown within the last 20 seconds of the game, or at least in regulation for that Rams and Bears. Very, very impressive that the Bears were able to tie things up, especially considering the conditions, considering the fact that it was a 4th-and-4 play. If you watch it, there was a lot of pressure on the defense from the Rams. Certainly very impressive. I was also very impressed by the Chicago Chicago Bears, just their fans are so loud, cheering so loudly. I mean, it was one of the loudest games that I've seen through television in quite some time. And so it was a very, very exciting game, quite a thriller. Went into overtime, almost went through all 15 minutes of overtime without there being a tie break. It wasn't until that field goal. And unfortunately for the Bears, they did lose because of an interception, among other things, of course. But that interception during overtime gave the Rams the possession that they needed in order to score that field goal. But the GWP Weekly surprise would certainly have to be the Bears with that amazing game-tying touchdown. Quite an effort for the number 2 seed. That team, of course, has had quite a few issues as far as when we look at wins, just hasn't really had a super great year the last few years, of course, but this year certainly quite a turnaround, being the number 2 seed, hosting that game. And what a show it really was. One of the most exciting endings. Again, 2 games this week going into overtime. That was after last week's wild card game had tied for the most lead changes in the fourth quarter. So it's been quite an exciting playoffs this year so far in the NFL playoffs, with 3 more games yet to come. A couple of those conference championships, again, as we mentioned, this Sunday, and the Super Bowl 2 Sundays after that. That is it for this week. We will see you next week here on GWP Weekly News.